Good morning and welcome to the 8th meeting of the COVID-19 committee. The first item on our agenda is to decide whether to take item 4 in private. Are members content to do that? I'm not seeing any disagreement from members there, so we'll proceed on that basis. Item 2 on the agenda is subordinate legislation, and I'd like to welcome Michael Russell, Cabinet Secretary for Constitution Unit and External Affairs, who will give evidence this morning on the Health Protection Coronavirus Restrictions Scotland Amendment No. 3 Regulations 2020, SSI 2020/164. And our members will have received a paper providing background and procedural information. So can I welcome the Cabinet Secretary to the meeting and invite him to make a short opening statement, please.
Thank you, Convener, and thank you for having me back again to the committee to discuss this time in more detail the Health Protection Coronavirus Restrictions Scotland Amendment No. 3 regulations, which amend the Health Protection Coronavirus Regulations 2020, which we more commonly know as lockdown restrictions. On the 21st of May, the Scottish Government published the coronavirus route map, which gives an indication of the order in which we will carefully and gradually seek to change current restrictions. It provides practical examples of what people, organisations and businesses can expect to see over time. The First Minister announced the outcome of the third review of the restriction requirements set out in the principal regulations on the 28th of May. The outcome of that review and the assessment of the evidence was that it was appropriate to move to phase 1 of the route map to using lockdown. This covered a wide range of policy areas and necessitated some amendments to the principal regulations. The amending regulations before you today give effect to various aspects of phase 1 of using lockdown. The Scottish Government made amending regulations by way of an affirmative procedure on the 28th of May. Those amendments entered into force on 29th of May, and a plenary vote on the amending regulations is planned for next week. The amending regulations make a number of adjustments to the principal regulations. These are to adjust areas where the decision to move to phase 1 necessitates a change to the restrictions on businesses and individuals. Amendments include changes to add a new reasonable excuse to leave your home and take part in outdoor recreation. Other amendments allow this to be undertaken with members of one other household at a time. There are also changes to the restrictions on businesses. Garden centres have been added to the list of businesses in Part 3 of Schedule 1, so they may reopen, and many have. Other retailers are now allowed to make adjustments to their premises to prepare for reopening in a later phase of the route map. The amending regulations also include some technical amendments concerned with how restrictions would be lifted. These provide that restrictions will be terminated by regulation rather than directions, making the processes clear and more transparent. There are further regulations to implement phases 1 of the route map. Once it's appropriate, we'll take steps to move to the next stages, and I look forward to discussing these steps with you at future meetings, but only when it is safe and scientifically secure to do so. But, Convener, I must say, fire is not guaranteed and it's not irreversible. If it becomes clear that the current measures are not sufficient to protect public health, we will put in place further measures, including regulations where necessary. The committee, of course, would have a crucial role in considering and scrutinising these regulations. I hope those initial comments have been helpful, and of course I'm open to questions.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary, for that introduction. We'll now move on to questions. I wonder if I can start off by asking a little more about the point that you touched on in your introductory remarks about the opportunity that the regulations provide to certain businesses currently closed to the public to take preparatory steps in advance to ensure compliance with physical distancing requirements on their premises once they're allowed to reopen. Can I ask you to say a little bit more about the types of businesses or services that fall into this category, and specifically what support and guidance the government is giving them at the present time to help them make the adjustments that they need to make?
Well, there is guidance, very clear guidance available in 2 levels. First of all, on the Scottish Government website, which is the background guidance, and then that leads on to further guidance. You ask is an important one because many people do want to start preparing themselves and their workplaces to
I've lost the cabinet. Sorry, Cabinet Secretary, I lost your audio there for a moment. Do you mind just going back a little and start again?
Of course. If you can people hear me now?
I can hear you now, yes.
Can people hear me? Okay.
Yes.
Yes, there are two levels of guidance. There is guidance that is available on the Scottish Government website, and there is guidance that therefore is available on from other sources, including employers and employers' organisations. But the basic issue is, when can people start to make preparations in order to move not back to the old normal, but to a new normal and to get back to work? And the route map is very clear on this. There are clear indications in the route map of when things will happen. If you look, for example, at the construction trade, there is a plan that the construction sector has agreed, and 2 sections of that will be implemented during this period, and the rest in phase 2. In non-essential office work, there's phases for introduction, but people need time to get ready. And many constituency MSPs have been approached by this too. So in this phase, if you are planning to and might be able to open and get back to work in the second phase, you're allowed to start preparing for that. And for example, in this phase, retail outlets should install screens, move the location of tills, prepare for queuing and social distancing, making sure that they can observe the need for social distancing, the need for hygiene that will be required when they reopen. So you have the route map. The route map is a very good guide to this, and anybody who in the route map sees that they could possibly reopen in stage 2 can begin to get ready for that. That is not guaranteeing when stage 2 will be, but it is saying that this is a continuous process.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. My second question, I suppose, relates to some of the issues we saw at the weekend that the First Minister was expressing some concern over yesterday, when people in rural areas in particular were very concerned about the large number of visitors coming in, obviously travelling substantial distances, and the impact that that might have. Now, what we have before us today are regulations. This is the law, but it's different from the guidance, which is issued from the Scottish Government. The guidance says you should not travel more than 5 miles from home to take exercise, but that's not what the law says. So, can you just share with us why the government has decided not to put this into regulation at the present time, and why it's just left it as guidance?
Well, I think that it's very important to look at this in a way that says we are all in this together. We all have a responsibility to find a way to move on. And the Scottish Government's approach has been to encourage, and the police approach, of course, through the 4Es, has been to encourage people, and only at the very end of the process to enforce. And that has worked up until now. Now, I think all of us were disappointed by some of the things that we knew about, saw, witnessed, heard about at the weekend. The figures speak for themselves. Sunday was the worst day that we have had in this entire process for dispersals, 797 compliant dispersals, another 146 dispersals after warnings. That's unacceptable. Now, this could be that people like the first day of holidays. People may have taken this too far. People may also have taken some time to adjust. The First Minister made it very clear on Monday that should this continue, then we will have to consider putting into regulation and into absolutely firm regulation the 5 miles issue, and possibly the issue of numbers of people meeting together. But there is common sense to be applied here, there is restraint to be applied here, and there's a basic truth that lockdown has not ended. These are gradual, small steps out of lockdown. And if people follow those steps and accept those steps and behave in a responsible fashion, we will be able to continue over a period of time to make those steps. If that does not happen, then we won't be able to continue to make this. And it is possible we will go back. So it is possible that we will want to come to your committee and to come and say, look, we hope that people would observe, and the vast majority are observing. We should stress that the vast majority are observing. But there are some people who seem unwilling to do so. And for the good of all of us, we have to insist that they do so. But at the present moment, we're saying to people, look, do not exercise more than 5 miles. 5 miles, isn't an absolute. 5 miles and 1 inch, clearly that's common sense. But do not go out of your local area. Do not go that far. If you are meeting together, then it is 2 households and not more than 8 people. And it has to be done outside, and it has to be done by social distancing. And by so doing, we will move on and we will avoid something that all of us are desperate to avoid, which is a second spike of this disease that will wreak havoc. And the way to do it is to observe the regulations. So we're asking people to do it. The police have a very difficult job, and they're moving forward in that way. In my own constituency, with going to islands, Calmac are enforcing piers. We are trying our very best to make sure that people realise how important this is. But the option remains to come back to this committee with further regulations. And if we have to use it, we will use it.
Okay, thank you, Cabinet Secretary. I have Stuart Stevenson, who would like to come in with a supplementary.
Thank you, Convener. Minister, the issue of 5 miles, I just want to explore a little bit from a personal viewpoint, but also on behalf of many people who live in rural locations. I have no shop at which I can buy food that's within 5 miles of where I stay. I've also, mea culpa, in my daily walk, my 12 miles, which took me a wee bit more than 5 miles away from home, I met a single person during that walk and spoke to them at probably about 10 metres distance. So is it not the case, Cabinet Secretary, that it would be all but impossible to firmly and unambiguously plant 5 miles into any of the legislative framework without creating a whole host of very serious difficulties, particularly for people in rural areas?
Well, yes, no, Mr. Stevenson. The absolute imposition of 5 miles would be ludicrous, because I think the nearest shop, which is part-time, is probably 4.2 miles from where I'm sitting now. But of course, we're not talking about the other part of the regulations, which is for essential food supplies, which is not is restricted to within your local area, but we've never said it is restricted in that way. So let us not confuse people by conflating two things that should not be confused. What we're saying is that people should not go more than 5 miles on their exercise, and certainly in terms of going out to socialise, that is also clearly desirable that they don't go more than that. But you could take 5 miles as being shorthand for within your local area, but also, as something that you should keep in your mind. Is this necessary? It is. At the weekend, I had reports, for example, of motorcyclists, large number of motorcyclists in Oban. They must have come from the Central Belt. That's more than 5 miles. That's not in your local area. They should not have been there. And that actually we have to talk about that very, very clearly. But going for essential shopping, of course. I mean, if I were to go for essential shopping from here, I would have to go more than 5 miles. That's never been part of it.
Okay, thank you, Cabinet Secretary. My next question is coming from Shona Robson, please.
Good morning. Just picking up on that issue about behaviours, and you said moving to the next phase is not guaranteed and not irreversible. And in response to Murdo's question, we picked up on the First Minister's very strong comments about what we saw at the weekend. But can you say more about how the Scottish Government's going to measure and monitor any impact of these amending regulations on the R number as we approach the next review period? It's one thing, I guess, the anecdotal evidence of what we see, but it's another trying to see whether or not that has a direct impact on the R number. So how is that being done, and will there be enough time before the next review period in order to see any impact on the R number?
Well, yes, of course. I mean, the calculation of the R number is complex. There are a range of factors that go into it. Death rate is one, but there are quite a number of factors that go into the R number. But there's a lot of data in the system, as a result of the weekend, for example. There's what I've quoted to you, the statistics from the police, which are regularly updated, of course. But there's also material from Traffic Scotland. There's also material from places like the national parks. There's the actual data in terms of road usage and transport usage that we can see, and all those things go together to build up a picture of what is happening. So it is quite important. I think you make a really good point to guard against merely anecdotal evidence. People are quite nervous at the present moment, and many people do not want to see the type of thing that they see, and sometimes they may exaggerate it, quite understandably in their own minds. But where the evidence, hard evidence, does exist, decisions are made on hard evidence, and they feed into the calculation of the R number. I know that the calculation of the R number is complex. There has been a presentation on it to party leaders and others. I don't know if the committee has had a presentation on it, but I think it is quite important that people understand how it is also a range and not an absolute. In terms of the second part of the question, in terms of how this feeds in to the process that we're engaged in, then clearly that is a continuous matter. There's a continual review of what is taking place, and the milestones are the 3 weekly milestones. But of course, if you look at, as I'm sure you have looked at, the roadmap, then you also see the judgments that will be made, and in actual fact, we can see those at the head of the. I'm just looking for them to hear the epidemic status line, which is the first line on the detail of the route map. And that changes phase to phase. Phase 1, high risk virus is not yet contained, continued risk of overwhelming NHS capacity without some restrictions in place. That's where we are now. Quite important that people realise that. Phase 2, the virus is controlled, but the risk of spreading remains focused on containing outbreaks. R is consistently below 1. And the number of infectious cases is showing a sustained decline. WHO's 6 criteria for using restrictions must be met. Any signs of resurgence are closely monitored as part of enhanced community surveillance. So there's a very clear statement of what we would need to be at in terms of the epidemic status and the criteria and the conditions in order to move to phase 2. And there's similarly clear statement of how we would move to phase 4 and how we would move phase 3 and phase 4. Sorry.
Thanks. Thank you for that. I guess there would need to be some distilling of what is the regulation that's potentially that's been relaxed, or the areas that have been relaxed. Are those the areas that are causing behavioural change, or is it just the fact that people felt they heard that there was an easing of lockdown? Has that in itself changed behaviour, or is it the need to tighten up the 5 mile guidance? Because obviously the really important change for many families has been the ability to meet another household outdoors, obviously to a maximum of 8 people, and that has been so important for families. And it may not be that change that has caused some of the behaviours. It may be the 5 mile issue. So how will the government make sure that in taking the next steps, you don't maybe throw the proverbial baby out with the bathwater?
Well, the steps, taking the next steps depend upon the epidemic status and the criteria and the conditions. So there's clearly the calculations will take place and are taking place, whether we have reached that those criteria and conditions have been met. Then many things feed into the R number and those calculations. I think it is difficult, of course. That's where judgment comes in, and the First Minister talks about this too. It is difficult then to say exactly what is affecting people's behaviour, and I think that we need to keep looking at that. And behavioural science comes into this too, and understanding how people behave. It could be that what we saw at the weekend was a combination of exceptionally good weather and a sense of relief after 10 weeks, and that was it, and it will disperse. It could be that will rain between now and the end of the year. Let us hope not. It's still a lovely day here in Argyll, but we need to watch very carefully. And I suppose the minimum you could say after the weekend is that our antennae are attuned to watching very carefully what happens over the next few days and into the weekend, and to very much hope that the message that we are putting out, the very clear message of the need to continue to observe lockdown with small easements, these are what they are, small easements in the first phase, is absolutely essential, and people continue to observe.
Okay, thank you, Shona. Next on my list is Adam Tompkins, and after Adam, it is Beatrice Worship. Firstly, Adam Tompkins, please.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, everyone. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. I've got a number of questions about these regulations, Cabinet Secretary. And the first is that, as I understand it, these regulations are already in force. They are already the law of the land. And until today, there has been absolutely no parliamentary scrutiny of them or parliamentary debate about them. I obviously welcome the fact that you're in front of us this morning answering questions about them. But these are regulations, you just described them as regulations that make small easements, but actually they make fairly significant changes to the way in which people are able to live their lives lawfully in this country. And yet, as I say, there has been no parliamentary scrutiny and no parliamentary debate about the nature of those changes. Is this an appropriate way of making law for the people of Scotland?
Well, normally it isn't, but as you know, and you and I both know, we are not in normal times, and therefore we're taking actions which are abnormal. We hope to stop doing that as the situation eases and changes. But we have to. This is the same debate that we've had for the last 10 weeks. We've had to balance the issue you rightly raised with the need to protect public health and to save lives, and we are not out of that situation at the present moment. The people of Scotland have worked incredibly hard together to get us to this stage. We need to go on working incredibly hard to complete the task, and there's a lot of the task still in front of us. But I've, for my part, I can only say I'm here on the first available opportunity to talk about these regulations. These were, came into force on Friday morning. The committee is meeting today. I am here. They will be presented to the Chamber next week, and we will be open then, and I'm happy to discuss them at any time in between. We are changing in these regulations, as you will have noticed, the way in which we move on from them to try and get some more scrutiny into that. And I will be reporting next week in the Chamber on the wider issues in the bill, just as we have agreed and indeed accepted your amendment to the second bill on the issue of looking at, it would be good. It would be really good if we didn't have to do this anymore. But we still have to do it. We must do it as transparently and openly as we can. But of course, I accept your premise that we should not be doing this as a matter of course.
I really welcome those comments, Cabinet Secretary, and the reason why I want to get them on the record is because I think there is just too much of a risk at the moment that the current extraordinary circumstances in which we find ourselves operating become the new normal, and we must not let that happen. So let me take a specific example of this where I'm a bit concerned about something that I think should usefully have been debated before it came into force, and that is the excision, the omission from the principal regulations of all references to the emergency period. Now, when the emergency regulations were first made in March, it was absolutely clear to everyone that they were to deal with a public health emergency. And yet now what we find, without a word of parliamentary scrutiny or oversight, that every reference to the emergency period, to that phrase, the emergency period, has been taken out of those regulations, so that they no longer read as if they pertain to an emergency, but they read as if they, do govern what is being called the new normal. So can you explain to us why all of those references to the emergency period have been removed and what the thinking is behind that, please?
Well, I would want to go and look at them very carefully because I'm unaware of what you've said, but I don't dispute it. I'm just unaware of it. But my immediate reaction is that they amend the principal regulations which still refer to the emergency. So they are not of themselves, the last word. They are amendments to the regulations which deal with the emergency. More than happy to confirm they are to do with the emergency. The main regulations are to do with the emergency. This is not, I absolutely accept that these regulations, should not last a moment longer than necessary. I've made that commitment on every occasion I've addressed them. We are changing the way that we can withdraw them to make it more subject to scrutiny. With the best will in the world, I do not believe that we are doing anything other than is required to be done at this moment. And I see, nothing sinister in any minor changes in the wording, because we are amending the main regulations, which are the emergency regulations. We have emergency bills. This is an emergency, and nobody doubts it.
I just think that it would be. I accept. The force of what you're saying, Cabinet Secretary. Of course, I do. We all understand that we face a public health emergency, which is, generating its own economic emergency and other crises in the economy and in society, to say nothing of the health service. But I do think that we should not so easily give up on the fundamental principle that laws for the people of Scotland are made by ministers only after parliamentary debate and scrutiny, and not before parliamentary debate and scrutiny. And it's really quite concerning to me that you don't seem to be aware of the fact that the principal thing that these amending regulations do is remove from the principal regulations every single reference to the emergency period. And I would like to have chapter and verse on from you and your officials as to exactly why that has happened and what its legal implications are. But let me move on to an issue about which I'm receiving an increasing volume of volume. Sorry,
Secretary, do you want to come back in?
Can I commit myself to write to you on that? Because I do not believe that there is any strange, sinister, malicious, or odd intent, and I believe it's to do with amending emergency regulations. But I want to be clear myself so that there is no doubt, and I don't want to be characterized as being unaware, that there is no doubt that we are not doing anything other than amending a set of emergency regulations, and there's no other import to it than that. But I'll write to you on that matter. If you ask for chapter and verse, I'll give it to you.
I'm grateful, and I look forward to receiving that. Hopefully that will be today. Or at any rate before Parliament.
I can't commit today.
At any rate, before Parliament is invited to vote on these regulations. I want to move on, Cabinet Secretary, to an issue about which I'm receiving an increasing amount of increasingly angry correspondence, which is a matter that you and I have debated before, which is the right to marry. And I was very pleased that the government accepted my amendment to the legislation that we passed a couple of weeks ago that requires you and your ministerial colleagues to take steps with the Registrar General to ensure that there is no disproportionate ban or bar on marriages or civil partnerships. But I am being written to practically every day by not just constituents in Glasgow, but by people across the country who have paid attention to this debate and who are still finding that their registrars are simply refusing to countenance even the possibility of getting married. So can I ask you, what steps have you taken so far with the Registrar General to put this right? And what can I tell my constituents and indeed the other people from across Scotland who've written to me about this matter to reassure them that this is a matter which is being taken seriously, and that we don't have to wait until phase 2 or phase 3 for the law which we unanimously passed a fortnight ago to take some effect?
Well, with the greatest respect, it is now in the document at phase 2, which is regarded as the safe place to put it. It is there, and I pay tribute to you in the greatest part because you have pressed this issue very strongly. And we agreed that this should be prioritized and is specifically referred to. In addition, I'm aware today of occasions on which the Registrar General has moved to ensure that the possibility of marriage is more widely available. For example, some people arrive in this country to get married under marriage visas, and those visas can expire. The grounds for expiry, grounds for renewing them, the Home Office is now saying could include coronavirus, but the Registrar General has decided, I understand, to ensure that they can bring forward marriages within Scotland without that extension. So there is an easing of that. And I would continue to encourage people who believe that they should and have the right to get married immediately, and there are circumstances that mean that that should happen, as we've agreed, then they should contact the Registrar General, they should contact you, they should contact their own MSPs. But it is also in phase 2 now, and I hope we can move to phase 2 as quickly as possible.
Okay, thank you. I think Ross Greer was keen to come in with a supplementary on Adam's first question.
Yes, thank you, Convener. Just back to this point of process. So these changes to the regulations were brought in, obviously, avoiding the affirmative procedure. I understand why the government has the ability to do that, given the broad urgency of the situation. And where regulations are being changed to increase the stringency of lockdown for the sake of public health, I can understand the urgency behind that. We're now in a position where the changes being made to the lockdown regulations are broadly changes to ease them. So I still fail to understand, even after the Cabinet Secretary's answers to Adam Tompkins' questions, why this set of changes could not have been brought under the affirmative procedure, allowing for scrutiny and a vote of Parliament before they were brought into effect. What was the urgency that meant that was not an appropriate course of action?
Well, with the greatest respect, I think it's because people were, are desperate to move on, and if the First Minister was to say, and there is a 3-weekly review underway, and people, that's well established. If people were to say, we'd like to do this, but we're going to have to go to the committee first, so you'll have to wait a week until we do it, I'm not sure people would have reacted terribly well to that. We are trying to consult on these as quickly as we possibly can. That is, we are entirely open about these. Despite the fact that they are small easements, I think they've been welcome easements, and I can see no harm in that. Equally, we will want to make sure, and do want to make sure, scrutiny is as firm and as rigid as possible, and that's what we're trying to do.
Okay, Ross, if you don't have a follow-up to that, I'm going to move on to Beatrice Wishart, please, and after Beatrice is Willie Coffey.
Good morning, Convener. Thank you, Convener, and good morning, colleagues and Cabinet Secretary. I'd like to go back a bit to the events of the weekend and the regulations that were published on Friday, but it felt on Monday as though they were up in the air again. And I would also like to pay tribute to the vast majority of people in Scotland who have abided by what they've been asked to do. And obviously, it's unfortunate that there's a few that sort of caused problems, considerable problems at the weekend. When the First Minister said she warned that restrictions might have to be imposed, and the Justice Secretary repeated that on the radio as well. Was it a blanket tightening of the rules, or were specific geographical areas might be considered in a local lockdown, or was it something else? I'd just like to get a bit more detail on that, please.
Thank you. I don't think we should get ahead of ourselves. I want to associate myself very strongly with the remarks you make about the vast majority of people in Scotland. That's true in Shetland, as it's true, in Argyll. The vast majority of people want to observe the rules and are observing the rules, and actually are angry at those people, those very few people, visible but few, who are not observing the rules and who are doing stupid things, who are, coming to visit their mobile home somewhere in the countryside when they shouldn't be staying anywhere away from home, who are traveling, a long distance to go somewhere to a beauty spot. They shouldn't be doing that, and people are angry at that. Now, we have some evidence from the police figures that there was more of that this weekend than there had been in previous weekends. Actually, not outrageously more, but substantially more. The weekend before was a wet weekend, so it's not really a fair comparison, but more than the weekend before that. That was contrary to what we wanted to see. These are small easements. We wanted those small easements, obviously, to be welcome, as they were and are welcome, but not to lead to behaviour which was out with those small easements. And that's, I suppose, the issue. This behaviour was out with the easement that took place. People travelling really long distances, more larger groups of people meeting, people not observing social distancing. So in all those circumstances, we now want to make sure that we look at all the options for moving forward. Now, I think the police, quite clearly will want to continue with their 4E strategy. That is good. I think if the behaviour changes and those people who were behaving stupidly at the weekend realise that was stupid and don't do it again, then I think we can move forward as we are moving forward. In terms of localising these, I think that would be hard to do. But of course, enforcement is an issue there, and there may be some places where more enforcement might be required than there has been last weekend. I think that would be fully understandable. So I think it's a step at a time at the present moment. But I think we have to be honest with people, as we've tried to be throughout this thing, to say that was a bit of a check, it was a bit of a shock, and that shouldn't happen again.
Thank you for the answer there. In terms of these regulations, you've touched on what the evidence and the data was used to prepare them. I wonder if you could expand a bit on that, and what changes to that data might result in us being presented with new, tougher regulations. And I mean, I think the Scottish Government's always been clear in its communications, so any changes would need to be strongly communicated as well. So how might that be achieved?
Yes, I think I'd go back to the route map, and I think the route map is really, really important for all of us, and it's a core document. We want to see the regulations observed quite clearly. So what your committee is considering today is what we want going forward. That's the new normal, is these regulations. So we want to make sure those are observed. That's number one. But the criteria are really important. And I read that out in response to Shona Robertson. It's quite important. Phase 1 epidemic status, a high risk that the virus is not yet contained. Continued risk of overwhelming NHS capacity without some restrictions in place. That's where we are. So we need to say to people that's actually the situations pertaining today. So we have to behave with that in mind. And then it says, if R is below 1 for at least 3 weeks and the number of infectious cases is starting to decline, that's good. That's where we are. But we have to make sure that continues to be the case. Evidence of transmission being controlled also includes a substantial sustained fall in supplementary measures, including new infections, hospital admissions, ICU admissions, deaths. So we've seen that. So we're in that position. But in order to move on, then we've got to observe some other things. So the situation then is all that is part of the making sure that's continuing to happen. That's not changing. That's not getting worse. And also making sure that if we were to move, as we consider moving to phase 2, we would have to make sure the next set of criteria were also coming in. The virus controlled, but the risk of spreading remains. Focus is on containing the outbreaks. And it asks for the R to be consistently below 1, the number of infectious cases showing sustained decline, the WHO 6 criteria, easing restrictions being met, any sign of resurgence closely monitored as part of enhanced community surveillance. In other words, the test and protect system is in place. So all of that is where we are and how we're moving. And it's not bingo, it's lockdown. We're not. This is slow, sustained. I think the First Minister used the baby steps. This is slow, sustained, doing the right thing. And if any actions looked as if we were being pushed in the other direction, that's when action would have to be taken. Now, that's not the evidence yet, but there's cause for concern after what we saw at the weekend, and that's what's being said.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Beatrice. Next, we're going to call Willie Coffey, and after Willie, it will be Monica Lennon, please.
Thanks very much, Convener. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. The relaxation that allows tennis, golf and bowling to take place has really been welcomed. But a number of constituents have asked me why we won't permit one-to-one coaching in things like tennis clubs or horse riding centres. The question they ask is, if we can allow people to manage up to 8 people in a garden and to travel around a bit more, why can't we allow professional coaches to observe all the guidelines, all one-to-one coaching situations?
I'd want to seek some more information on the precise reason, but my initial reaction is that clearly the difficulty in social distancing may be the issue in there, and that there may be some questions. But given that there's subsidiary guidance for a whole range of sports, as you know, through Sports Scotland, I think I'd want to see what the subsidiary guidance is on those before answering that definitively. So if you'll let me, I'll ask my official to communicate with you on what precisely the reasoning behind that. I'm glad that there's welcome for tennis and bowls. I know, as they brought up in Ayrshire, I know bowls is big, so I'm glad that people are glad about that, and that is useful.
It's not a question of trust, isn't it? No, I mean, when professionals are delivering coaching services, I would imagine we would trust them totally to put in place any distancing guidelines that were appropriate to be applied and so on. So I don't imagine it's an issue about trust. It must be something else, but the numbers appear to be very small. 1-to-1 seems reasonable. Where you might have up to 8 people in a garden, for example.
I think, as I say, I'd like to find out the reasoning for this. I mean, I know, that individual sports are different. So I think I really have to say that we will try and give you some reasoning on this and find out about it, if that's okay. Okay,
right. Thank you. Thanks, convener.
Okay, thank you, Willie. Next, Monica Lydon, please, and after Monica, Annabel Yoon.
Good morning, thanks, convener. I've got a couple of questions for the Cabinet Secretary. Welcome back. Given that the regulations allow more businesses to begin preparations for a return to work, can you say a bit more about what guarantee workers can be given that they have recourse to refuse a return to work if they feel unsafe? And alongside that, what additional support can businesses expect from government and local authorities to adapt to home working or to adapt their workplace?
Yeah, those are really important considerations, and you will recall during the second bill I made some commitments to Colin Smythe in terms of issues he'd raised in terms of workplace protections and health and safety. But let's start with the absolute. Workers have the absolute right to a working environment. There are no ifs and buts about that. That is exactly what the legislation says, and not coronavirus legislation. Legislation for a long time has said that is the case. So nobody who is being asked to return to work and to prepare to return to work should be going into circumstances that they regard as unsafe, and they should be making that clear to their trade union, and they should be making it clear to their employer that they have to do and should not do. It's not a question of being forced to do it. They should not do that. The environmental health has a responsibility to ensure safe inspection of premises. That's a huge job at the present moment. And I know that in many local authorities, this is being done by issuing checklist or guidance to make sure it is observed and reacting thereafter to complaint. And those people can complain to their councillors or directly about those issues. Trade unions have a big role here to be very active and to represent people who are concerned and worried and who regard themselves as being asked to do something that they should not do. And we want to make sure that they don't do those things, because it's in the interest of the individual, it's in the interest of company, and it's the interest of society and community that unsafe workplaces do not open and cannot open. Because unsafe workplaces in these circumstances would lead to transmission of the disease. And that's what we want to prevent. So there has to be a guarantee that that's not going to happen. So most employers are responsible. Most employers will ensure that those workplaces are safe. Most employers will consult with their workforce and with trade unions to make sure it is safe. But there is an absolute legal right not to go to work in those circumstances. And there is a role for local authorities and for the Health and Safety Executive to make sure that that is enforced. And that will be strongly supported by the Scottish Government.
I'm grateful to the Cabinet Secretary for his answer, and I share his sentiments, and I do acknowledge that the Scottish Government and the STUC and a number of trade unions have worked closely together. But I was concerned by a report published by the University of Strathclyde, and it had some coverage in the Daily Record yesterday, and it found that a very large number of contact centre workers are terrified of returning to work in an environment that they describe as being full of risks. The report talked about a toxic mix of inadequate or impossible social distancing, a lot of face-to-face contact, inadequacies of sanitation, issues around ventilation, and a dread of contamination from workstations, particularly where there's a lot of hot desking going on. And many of those workers felt that home working was an urgent necessity. So, Cabinet Secretary, I appreciate your answer and the intention behind the regulations and the guidance being issued by the Scottish Government, but how concerned are you and government colleagues that the reality is quite grim and quite dangerous for many workers in Scotland?
Well, there's a number of answers to that. First of all, sectoral guidance is being prepared with the STUC, and that's good. So there will be sectoral guidance of the economy, and if there are individual sectors who have a particularly bad set of practices, those are going to be picked up very quickly and acted upon. There's also the issue of what the route map, and I keep going back to the route map, but forgive me, it's the right document to go back to, because it says important things. The route map looks at what's going to happen with businesses, and if you look at phase one, where are we now? Well, remote working is the default position, as so in the first paragraph. So remote working is what people should be doing, and any employer should be quickly disabused by trade unions, by the health and safety executive, by local authorities. That's not the case. Non-flex essential outdoor workplaces with physical distances are resuming. Construction phase 0 to 2 of industry restart, but the industry is to consult government before progressing to phase 2. And then preparatory work that we talked about. But then when we go to phase 2, even under phase 2, it says remote working remains the default position for those who can. And it says so under phase 3 too, and under phase 4 it says remote and flexible working remains encouraged. So we're in a change in this. Companies should be thinking, all organisations should be thinking about how remote working can be supported. The Scottish Parliament, for example, as you will know, has put out information for Parliament staff and MSPs about how remote working should work and about how you should assess your workspace. And that's good practice. And I would encourage other employers to do so. But I would also encourage those who, in the end, if any employers refuse to do so, then they must be subject to the rigour of the law. And, they are not allowed to open at the present moment. That's what it says. Non-essential indoor, non-office-based workplaces resume once relevant guidance agreed. That's under phase 2, not under phase 1.
Thank you, and I hope that we're setting a good example by showing that home working can be done productively. If I can ask another question that's business related, then I'll move on to something else. I mentioned the Daily Record. Someone else has asked me to look at an article in the Racing Post. I'm not a subscriber, but I've had a look at it, and the issue they've raised is around the reclassification of betting shops in England to non-essential small retail, and this means that they'll be allowed to open in the middle of June. Can the Cabinet Secretary clarify if the Scottish Government has any similar plans, and if so, what measures in terms of social distancing might have to be brought in for betting shops?
I'm not aware of that, I'm sorry to say, but I will find that out and come back to the member. It's not on the list of premises that I have, but it could be that it's the case, but I just don't know. So I don't want to mislead anybody, so let me find that out and come back to you. Clearly, they couldn't open without sufficient social distancing, including screens, but there are screens, I believe, in betting shops. Like you, I do not take the Racing Post, and I'm not a habitué, but I do know enough to know there are screens, but we'll find out and come back to you, okay?
Thank you. I want to ask a bit more about social distancing, given that the regulations now permit the meeting of more people from the one household, maximum of 8 and so on. What do you foresee in terms of enforcement of the 2 metre rule? I know others have touched on it a little bit, but I've got a particular scenario in mind in relation to the rollout and implementation of the test and protect system. We know that contact tracing is a big element of that. So I've been asked by a number of constituents and other people from different organisations, what will be the consequences for anyone who's identified through the contact tracing who's found to have been in close contact with someone from a different household? I think I've heard previously that the First Minister say that information is held by the NHS and the NHS alone, but I just wondered if you could give a bit more clarity around the enforcement of that.
Well, the Test and Protect scheme, is underway and is operating. I don't know if the committee has had a briefing on it, but I think rather than go into detail on the Test and Protect scheme, it might be useful that the committee got a full briefing on it. But as far as I am aware, and I presume this is the case, the data is entirely confidential. And if the worry is about that data being used by others, then I think there's an absolute guarantee that it cannot be. But I would want to make sure that the people who are operating Test and Protect brief the committee in full about how it will operate and how about contact tracing operates. They're not subject to part of these regulations at the present moment, and therefore I'd want to make sure that you've got the best and most up-to-date advice and information on that, if that's okay.
I think a briefing of that nature would be very helpful. And just if I can put, I suppose, a scenario to the Cabinet Secretary, and it might sound hypothetical, but it's a scenario that's very, very familiar to all of us, and it's about being able to hug people that you love, people who have seen their parents, grandparents, children for the first time in absolutely ages. And I've been asked by a number of people if it's clear that you're able to practice good hand hygiene, you've washed your hands, you've got good cough etiquette, you've used a tissue and so on. If you've immediately washed your hands, perhaps you're wearing a face covering, what is the scientific advice that the government is receiving that says that you can't hug your granny in those circumstances? Is that something that you've been briefed on, Cabinet Secretary, and as we look to further easement or tightening, are we going to get to a point where we want to re-establish that human contact, a 10-second hug with your granny? How far away are we from that scenario?
I don't know, and I don't want to give people false information or false hope. I mean, the information that I have and the regulations we have are very clear that you should have good social distancing apart from the immediate members of your own household. If you live with your granny, there is no instruction that you cannot hug your granny. It is not hugging per se. It is bringing people together, from different circumstances with the risk of causing the transfer of the virus. That's the issue. Now, I'm very happy to ask that the committee be briefed on the full science of this. But I think we should be very clear and not confuse things at the present moment. The slight easement of the lockdown is contingent upon people observing social distancing, strictly observing social distancing, no matter how difficult that is. And the joy of people who you haven't seen, your granny or anybody else, for a long period of time, close to, is one part of it. But you can't do all the things you want to do of transmitting that virus. But again, I want to make sure you have, as a committee and as individuals, the best advice. So that is another area where I think you should be given the scientific advice that this.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Monica. I mean, I think Cabinet Secretary Monica Lydon does raise a number of interesting issues, because there are a whole range of scenarios that I've had put to me by constituents and others, and I just think it's actually very difficult in terms of the guidance that's issued. We can't, as MSPs, interpret the guidance for people, and it's probably not reasonable, to be fair, to expect you to interpret the guidance for people either. But I think it just demonstrates the issues that we're in when we have guidance that does leave grey areas, and people effectively are asked to make up their own minds, and it can be very difficult. I don't expect you to respond to that immediately. Yes, please do if you want.
Could I perhaps just? I think you raise a very good point, and there is often an expectation of us as MSPs, and I've myself appearing like this in front of the committee. The odd person watches it and then comes along and says, "Tell me what to do." We have to explain to people what's in the guidance. We have to have a common sense view of the guidance, but the guidance is simple and clear. A lot of work goes into making it simple and clear, and we can over intellectualize it. There's a modest, small easement of lockdown at the present moment, which allows some things to happen which weren't happening before. But please observe it, otherwise, the virus will spread. It's the simplest message: stay at home and save lives, with some very small changes to that, which are helpful to people, but there's still a long road to travel.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to move on to Annabel Ewing, please, and after Annabel, it'll be Ross Greer.
Thank you, convener. Good morning, colleagues, and good morning, Cabinet Secretary. Returning to, I think, a key theme this morning, which is the issue of compliance. What I took from the weekend was that actually, perhaps the biggest risk of what happened at the weekend is, and the Cabinet Secretary has alluded to the fact that the vast majority who are complying and doing the right thing were very angry and very frustrated, and actually very disappointed, because they recognise that the longer that this goes on, the longer they're not going to be doing all the things that they would otherwise have enjoyed doing with their lives. So I think that's the biggest risk, that if we lose the vast majority of folk, we have a very big problem. And so I do understand, and I very much take on board the comments from Police Scotland this morning, that the police with consent in Scotland are hugely important, fundamental bedrock of our society, the police with consent. I do get that, particularly as a lawyer. However, we are in the midst of a pandemic, and I just wonder, come the next review, what specifics the government will take from the events of last weekend, and of course we wait to see what happens this weekend and the next weekend. In my view, it would be helpful perhaps to have a bit more clarity about the 5 miles, irrespective of whether we move to be more prescriptive, but to have a bit more clarity. My understanding of it was that it was kind of really based around, if you needed to see a family member, did you need to have a rest stop so that you wouldn't be going into their house to use the bathroom, for example? That was one takeaway that I took from it. So if that is not the right takeaway, then I think it would be helpful to have a very clear steer as to what the 5 mile limit means, because it seems that for different people it may mean different things. Now, obviously, it didn't mean going out to Loch Lomond and spending the day and parking up the side of people's houses and all the rest of it. It clearly didn't mean that, but I do think a bit more clarity would be really, really important to ensure that we keep the vast majority of people in Scotland on board, which they have been from the start.
Yes, let me start at that point. The vast majority of people in Scotland are on board. They want to stay on board. They are angry at those people who don't appear to be on board. They want to get them back on board, and that's what we all want. And the police are absolutely right to say that is, policing by consent. It's really important that people are persuaded so to do. But let's be clear about what the regulations say. Let's deal with exercise, and let's deal with getting together. Let me put it that way. In terms of exercise, I think it's very clear. You can now go out, you can have exercise, but you really should stay in your local area. And the 5 mile thing is a guide to what your local area is. It is not, if you live in Dumbarton, it is not the Falls of Falach on Loch Lomond's side. There was a huge number of people there at the weekend. It is not within 5 miles of any population centre, essentially. So, there are issues in there about how things should be done. So that's the guide. It's not, Stuart Stevens quite rightly said, it's not, if you live 10 miles from somewhere and you have to go shopping, that's a separate issue. And then there's the issue of getting together with people. And one of the issues that emerged over the weekend was the numbers of people sometimes in gatherings. And the question is how that is dealt with. it's 2 households. It's a maximum of 8 people. And, the First Minister was quite clear that, this may be people going a bit further, but they shouldn't be travelling the length and breadth of the country. I suppose one could say they should be doing a Dominic Cummings. They shouldn't be travelling 250 miles to do that, not least because it would be difficult not to use facilities which perhaps you would rather not use in those circumstances. So these are minor easements which people should be pleased about. And if they are exercised responsibly, there is no problem with it. It is moving on from where they are. But when they're exercised irresponsibly, when you see, those pictures we saw at the weekend, so sometimes of beauty spots, then we say that's not the right way to behave. That's putting people's lives at risk, because this is the bottom line, it is about the ability of the virus to spread in those circumstances. So we must avoid spreading the virus.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for his answer. Taking up that last comment, I absolutely, totally agree, and the Cabinet Secretary had earlier reiterated that the context in which this legislation is being put forward, which is that we're in the midst of a pandemic, the like of which we've certainly not seen in our lifetimes. And I think that is a really important message to repeat and repeat and repeat, because I think with the easing a wee bit at the weekend, and as has been said, people were absolutely desperate. They were desperate to do something different that was a bit more normal. But with the easing and with the nice weather, and it's fairly nice today, and I guess it may not be as nice as last weekend for a wee while, but it will be okay. There is a danger that people just think, well, you know what, it's Scotland, fresh air, we're outside. And allied to that, I would say as well, that the tone of that public health message, alongside the position of face coverings, which was the other issue, substantive issue I wanted to raise, I think is really important. I was at a supermarket last night. I think I was the only person in the entire shop wearing a face covering. I think we need to have further reflection on what our message is there. I know what the message is, that we should be doing this, but evidently most people are not yet doing that. And I think that's an issue of tone as well, because if that is something that we're all having to do, it changes the tone of the way that we think about this. Perhaps the Cabinet Secretary could comment on that.
I agree with you. I agree with you that the issue of face coverings is one I think that's coming again centre stage, and I have noticed, myself wearing a face covering at a filling station. I was the only person who's doing so, and I think we need to that. And I know there's a lot of thinking going on about that. I would encourage people to wear one, to wear one when in shops. Sometimes I think people think they're going to be stared at or looked at. We should get to a stage where if everybody's doing it, then the person who's not doing it is the person who's looked at and stared at. So I think you're right, and I think we need to look at that very, very seriously. There has been debate about the efficacy of it, but I think that there is a growing public view that we should see it more.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Annabelle. Okay, move on to Ross Greer, and after Ross it'll be Stuart Steen.
Thank you, Convener. As has been mentioned a couple of times already this morning, my constituents at Loch Lomond had a frankly horrendous weekend. We take the example of those at Luss. The stories from there were widely reported. I think that the First Minister shared the stories. That's a population, significantly elderly population, proportionately. They have not had cases of the virus up until now, but that's a community that are now terrified that over the course of the weekend the virus was brought into their community. But not just the virus, a lot of pretty extreme antisocial behaviour. People were defecating in their gardens. It was pretty horrendous for them. And I'm interested in the connection between those events, and they were clearly not just isolated to Loch Lomond, unfortunately, and the timing of the government's announcement. To me, it seems that making an announcement about the easing of lockdown, where there's a requirement for some pretty nuanced messaging and for the reinforcement of that nuance before it really sinks in, But to do so immediately before a weekend, and particularly one where the weather forecast was so good, was increasing the likelihood of something like this to happen. So could the Cabinet Secretary explain what the rationale was for getting that announcement out, the easing of those lockdown measures immediately before a weekend, rather than waiting to announce it earlier in a week, which allows for repeated reinforcement of the important public safety elements of that message before a weekend where events like that might occur?
I think it's an interesting point. I need to reflect upon it. The 3-week review, comes to an end on a Thursday, and there is a strong expectation that a decision will be made on that Thursday. I think we've been trying to help people as much as possible to move on, even in a limited way, given the length of time that people have been in lockdown. I think my only reaction to that is to say I would want to think about that, and I think that point is well made. I don't know what others' views would be of that in terms of the First Minister and others, but I think it's a point well made. It's a point worth thinking about, and I think it's a takeaway from this. Thank you for it. I don't know the difference if you were to do it at a different day. I don't know whether people on the assumption that it was going to happen ended a good weekend. I mean, we did see an increase in activity and behaviour over the Easter weekend, and we did see it, at a very good weekend 2 weeks ago. The figures actually show that although there were more people this last weekend, there was good weather. So I think it's part of the discussion, and I'm grateful for it.
Thank you. That's all from me, Convener. Just grateful that the Cabinet Secretary will bear that in mind in future.
Okay, thank you. And lastly, Stuart Stevenson, please.
Thank you, Convener. I have 3 comparatively small ones, but the bigger of the 3 is the one thing we haven't heard referenced in any of this discussion at the moment is the position of children. Now, we know that the schools are going back on the 11th of August. That's fine. But in particular, I'm exercised by the problems faced by children who are in households where a parent is shielding. For me, I'm in my 12th week of lockdown. That's 0.3% of my life. For an 8-year-old, and I have an 8-year-old in my close family, that's 3% of her life. She has met no other children at all in that period. And it's an extremely onerous issue. Now, I find I can identify no solution to that. But what I would invite the Cabinet Secretary to do, perhaps, is to speak and get something that addresses the particular issue and helps children of that kind. I know that my close family members' mental health is fluctuating a bit more than I would like to see it to do, because she's shut away with 2 parents in a house with no garden, for example. So I think we want to put children centre stage. The 11th of August is great, but it is actually, in a child's mind, an incredibly long time away. And there's no prospect of anything remotely approaching a summer holiday. So it's simply an ask, which I'd like you to acknowledge and perhaps take away, because I don't have any expectation that you've got a magic answer. I'll deal with the other 2 as well, just to make best use of time. The second issue is, again, in a sense, an ask. Some numbers and boundaries are inevitably arbitrary, but you have to have them somewhere. And at the moment, we categorise people who are 70 or over as being vulnerable. I am such a person. Some other countries have basically drawn the line at 75 rather than at 70. And when you look at the outcomes for people who become infected for COVID, you can sort of see why they might have chosen 75, because it really is as you move towards 80 that the outcomes become particularly adverse. And I just wonder whether the government is asking for or receiving advice that might lead to our considering pushing that 70 back a bit. Now, the final one is a very specialist and small thing, although it will be of interest to the convener, because I've been approached by someone in the area he represents on this subject. I think I'm the only person in the Parliament who's a pilot's licence. And there is a plea I've had from a number of people to be able to resume solo flying from and back to the airport of origin. Now, why is that important for this small minority of people? Well, the answer is because your ratings, your licence may become invalidated if you don't do some flying. And of course, if you're flying on your own in an aircraft and you may be flying out of an airfield where there's nobody else present. And now, it just isn't something that's referred to, and I've got Spice advice on it, it's perfectly clear. And again, I think there's a broader issue in looking at further iterations, regulations, Cabinet Secretary, about solo activities of general, of which this is just one example that we might consider taking some more helpful positions on, if that's appropriate. Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Stevenson. I mean, they're three very good points. Let me address them in order. On the issue of children and shielding, I think it's an absolutely tremendous point and needs to be borne in mind. I to share my colleagues, I think, with the Deputy First Minister and with the Minister for Children, and to see what additional thinking can take place. The wider issue of mental health, this process is a very important one. We all are aware of it. We're all aware of our own reactions, and we know this is a difficult time for all of us, and it's particularly difficult for others, and it is causing, and I think all of us receive emails and messages from people who clearly are struggling at this time. And whilst there has been a commitment in supporting people with mental health, I think we should bear in mind that that is one of the criteria we have to consider as we move forward and as we look at on people's mental health and the effect on the long-term mental health of individuals and how we can help with that. But it's a really good point. Let us take it on. The point about people over 70 is also well taken. In one or two places, the people who are shielded are over 65, which would just bring me into it. There has been a variation in different places. I do know from my own correspondence that over 70s some people who are over 70 are particularly annoyed about this. They've been annoyed, for example, that in many places they're not being allowed to volunteer to drive because they're shielded, and they want to volunteer, they're allowed to do some of the things that they want to do. I think we should remain very sensitive to this, and as with all categorizations, not everybody over 70 is the same, not everybody over 75 is the same. So I think that will be a matter under continual thought and review. We are probably where we are in this phase of the pandemic, but I think we should. As to license, there are, the amazing richness of human experience never ceases to amaze me. There are people who are wanting to be allowed to do things in almost every area of life, and you don't know they're doing it sometimes until they write to you about it. I think it's an area we need to look at. We need to understand how many people are affected, what the risks are of it, and to see whether something can happen, without difficulty. I'm surprised to hear it's not happening. I do know gliding has been an issue which representation has been made. There's been lots of representations about sailing, and there is now an ability for people to, not to travel too far to a marina, but if they have a boat, to be able to sail with a member of their family and not to go ashore and to do all sorts of things. So if that is not being looked at, it's a takeaway I'll take and see if somebody will look at it.
Okay, thank you, Cabinet Secretary. I think Stuart Stevenson has exhausted his questions. I've got one quick final supplementary from Willie Coffey, please.
Thanks very much, Convener. Again, Cabinet Secretary, is the government thinking about or planning safe exercise spaces or even dedicated time slots for our shielded groups to enable them to get out and get some fresh air and a little bit of exercise, but safely? Of course, I know that some communities in Ireland are doing this, and it seems to be affected where dedicated time slots are offered to the shielded groups for exclusive use to walk in parks and open spaces and stuff?
I know that the First Minister and I know that Patrick Health and the Chief Medical Officer are looking at, considering, with advice, the issue of how we can help people who are shielded to move on and to, since the issue has been in sharp relief with the decision of the UK government. We have not implemented those changes and made it clear those changes are not being implemented in Scotland at the moment. But I think the First Minister has made it clear that she'll want to say something about shielding as soon as she can. So I hear what you're saying.
Okay, thanks, Willie. Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. I think that's through all the members who wanted to ask questions. So can I thank you for your evidence this morning. We now move on to item 3 on the agenda, which is the formal consideration of the SSI. And I would invite the Minister to move motion S5M 21871 that the COVID-19 Committee recommends that the Health Protection Coronavirus Restrictions Scotland Amendment Number 3 Regulations 2020, SSI 2020/164 be approved. Minister?
Formally moved, Convener.
Thank you, Minister. I'm assuming no members want to contribute at this point, in which case I will put the question in the motion. The question is that motion S5M 21871 be agreed to. If any member disagrees, can they indicate by typing N into the chat bar now? I am not seeing any disagreement, and therefore we take it that that motion is approved. The committee will now publish a report to Parliament setting out our decision on the statutory instrument in the coming days. At this point, can I thank the Cabinet Secretary for his attendance? Can I remind members that as we're about to go into private session, they should now log out of Blue Jeans and log in immediately if they can into MS Teams. And I close the public session of the meeting. Thank you.